Hello everyone, this is Dr. Mark Joseph O'Connell and this is Fashioning Canada, Dress, Commodity Flows, and the Material Politics of Canadian Identity from the Interrogating Canadian Identities, les identités canadiennes, une interrogation, 2026 from York University. My presentation, Fashioning Canada, Dress, Commodity Flows, and the Material Politics of Canadian Identity draws from my recent book, Canadian Fashion Economies, published by Bloomsbury in 2025. For me, Canadian fashion history belongs at the center of Canadian history because fashionable garments have catalyzed and actively participated in making the social, economic, and political worlds through which Canada came to be. Dress also gives material form to structures that can otherwise feel distant or abstract. Objects such as the Chilkat blanket, beaver fur hat, or Hudson's Bay coat can carry cultural memory or histories of colonial power directly into the material world. Fashion communicates as quick as lightning. It marks affiliation and aspiration and places the body within aspects and systems of social and economic value. Also, because clothing remains so close to the body, it allows us to encounter large historical structures at an unusually human scale. Political identity becomes something that is worn. My research lies precisely at the intersection of dress, commodity, circulation, and Canadian identity. I'm interested in the ways objects acquire national meanings as they move through economies, communities, and historical interpretations. So the guiding question for this presentation is, what becomes visible when we understand Canadian identity as something materially fashioned through circulating objects? To answer that question, my methodology is object-based. Garments signal class, identity, gender, aspiration, and affiliation. They also do some pretty heavy economic lifting, as you will see. However, if we only look for elite metropolitan fashion for our research objects, we miss the quotidian, the rural, grassroots, as well as the First Nations makers and communities whose sophisticated material cultures long predated European colonization. We also miss the fact that Canada as a whole was never isolated from global markets. From the beginning, both First Nations and colonial populations were actively engaged in trade, adaptation, exchange, and commodity flows. This is why objects are so fascinating. Written archives usually preserve the voices of governments, corporations, religious organizations, and merchants. Fashion objects can tell us other stories. My methodology then is object-based. I look at garments and textiles intrinsically, fibers, dyes, repairs, techniques, and wear, as well as extrinsically, what they communicate about status, labor, gender, race, spirituality, colonialism, nationalism, and economy. Shout out to fashion scholar Ingrid Maida, who has written the benchmark academic monograph on object-based research, The Dress Detective. So, I begin with the Chilkat dancing blanket. These are extraordinary works of artistry, skill, status, and exchange. Originating with Tsimshian peoples of northern British Columbia and Alaska and later adopted by Tlingit and Haida communities, these were not mere coverings for warmth. They were prestige objects, ceremonial garments, visual histories, and economic goods. They communicated lineage, clan, affiliation, power, and social standing. They circulated within systems of gifting, display, and reciprocal obligation. I examined the Chilkat blanket Bear with Young and others at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, both for iconography as well as their superlative weaving technique. The Chilkats were actively used within potlatch ceremonies, and despite the ban on the potlatch, the techniques were safeguarded and passed down through weavers themselves. They are therefore a living example of cultural heritage, as Chilkat weaving is still practiced today. These are examples of individual weaver marks on various Chilkats I examined at the Museum of Natural History. These were definitely individual fashion objects that were created by designers. Okay? And just to be clear, when I call the Chilkat a fashion object, it is not to diminish its ceremonial or cultural significance. It is to challenge the colonial restriction of fashion solely to Europe and to colonial populations. The second object is the beaver-felt top hat. This handsome example is from our own Seneca Fashion Resource Center collection at our Newnham campus. The beaver pelt was highly desired because its dense underfur could be felted into a smooth, durable, water-resistant surface ideal for hats. In Europe, the beaver hat became a status object. Demand for it created a transatlantic economy that drew French and British traders into increasingly deep relationships with First Nations trappers, guides, diplomats, and trading partners. That trade helped finance colonial settlement, shaped transportation routes, intensified imperial rivalries, and irrevocably altered the lives of First Nations communities. The significance of the top hat extends far beyond its status as an accessory for personal adornment, however. According to the excellent and unfortunately now defunct HBC Heritage website, beaver fur top hats were water resistant, and before the use of umbrellas became common, their wide brims were very useful at keeping the rain away, a very good marketing advantage in England, no doubt. The HBC also notes the superstitions that added to the popularity of the toppers. Quote, "It is said that a beaver hat made the wearer more intelligent," end quote, and also that by rubbing the oil into one's hair, it was possible to develop a remarkable memory. They also report the rumor that a deaf person would regain their hearing by wearing a beaver hat. Who knew? Aside from the physical and apocryphal attributes, the top hat is a potent visual communicator within social, cultural, and political spheres. These fellows, clutching their hats as they hashed out the future constitution in PEI in 1864, definitely knew the emblematic draw of their dapper toppers. The national imagery that later gathered around the fur trade era voyageur emerged from an economy whose origins were thoroughly transnational. My next fashion object, the Hudson's Bay blanket coat, reveals how material circulation can solidify into national imagery. The HBC point blanket, the coat is made from, entered North American fur trade economies as an imported trade good. First Nations consumers incorporated the blankets into existing material practices, giving the commodity meanings that far exceeded the intentions of the original manufacturer. The long-distance company operations conjoined London capitalist endeavors to First Nations knowledge within an expanding colonial economy. Here, commodity circulation carried political power alongside material goods. The transformation of trade cloth into the capote and later into the Canadian blanket coat reveals how objects acquire new meanings through use and adaptation. The garment continued to accrue historical associations as it moved between communities and social settings. There's a missing belt on the HBC coat from the Seneca Fashion Resource Center collection that is a visual reference to the ceinture fléchée, a finger-woven sash strongly connected to Métis visual culture. By the 19th century, the coat had evolved from the practical worlds of winter mobility into the visual culture of Anglo-Canadian leisure through the tobogganing clubs of Montreal. By the 1960 Winter Olympics, Hudson's Bay blanket coats appeared as Team Canada parade wear. A material form shaped through intercultural encounter had been condensed into a familiar emblem of Canadian winter identity. I describe this process as sartorial nationalism in the book, the use of dress to stabilize and circulate an image of the nation. National symbols, however, can be selective communicators. The blanket coat can communicate Canada with extraordinary efficiency while simultaneously erasing the First Nations history from which it emerged. The next object is a quilt, and it was given to me by my neighbor after I had an emergency surgery. It was made by her mother, a virtuoso quilter, and it speaks to me of community and of care, which I find so much a part of the Canadian DNA. The traditional romantic historical narrative suggests that early colonial Canadians, particularly in rural Upper Canada and Quebec, clothed themselves almost entirely through necessity. Spinning, weaving, sewing, and wearing homespun as part of a domestic agricultural economy. That narrative is not entirely false, but it is incomplete. Les Acadiens were the community that actually came closest to that ideal, but no colonial population functioned outside of globalized trade networks. Rural households certainly produced homespun cloth. However, by the early 19th century, country stores carried imported textiles and accessories that allowed consumers to modify clothing and participate in changing fashions. Rural Canadians were practical consumers, but they also possessed what Douglas McCullough describes, quote, as an eye for fashion, end quote. Quilts preserve this history particularly well. Their fragments of printed cotton suggest the earlier lives of garments that were worn, reused, and finally incorporated into patchwork. A quilt is therefore more than domestic craft. It is a material culture archive of consumption. Within rural economies, such materials signified both taste and aspiration. Homespun and imported cloth also coexisted within the same garments at times. Adrienne Hood's research on homespun clothing lined with softer cotton demonstrates how local labor could be joined to globally circulating commodities. Women were central to this economy. Their sewing and dressmaking constituted skilled economic labor, translating available materials into garments suited to local circumstances. The transition toward mechanized textile production was similarly gradual. Domestic production continued alongside mills and emerging factories, producing a rural fashion economy in which older practices survived within new commercial systems. Cotton makes the global dimensions of this history especially visible. The printed fabrics found in Canadian garments and quilts connected rural households to Atlantic commodity networks that were sustained by enslaved labor. An apparently intimate domestic textile could therefore carry the history of different systems of exploitation. The quilt ultimately holds these histories together. It preserves women's labor, consumer desire, and the afterlife of garments while revealing how deeply local Canadian domestic life was embedded within global systems of exchange. One of the most striking contrasts in my book is between two 18th century women who were both named Marie. Queen Marie Antoinette of France and Marie Marguerite Rose of Louisbourg. Marie Antoinette's gown, now held at the Royal Ontario Museum, is one of the most spectacular garments associated with Canadian fashion collections. I take issue at times with the overemphasis on rare silk dresses in fashion history. However, if we are going to go there, you can't get much better than this spectacular gown. It was given by the French queen to a lady-in-waiting who emigrated to England before the Revolution and was kept within that family until it went to auction, where it was purchased by ROM director Charles Corelli in 1929. It is a formal court ensemble of silk satin with a fitted bodice, matching petticoat and train, richly decorated with metallic threads, spangles, glass stones, appliqued ribbons, bows, feathers, flowers, and a shimmering surface ornament. Attributed to Marie-Jeanne Rosebertin, the Queen's famous marchand de mode, the dress represents the height of 18th century French court fashion. It is breathtaking as a fashion object. It is technically exquisite, materially luxurious, and impossible to separate from the opulence and political symbolism of the Ancien Régime of France. Yet the danger of beginning and ending with this gown is that it repeats a familiar hierarchical trope. Marie Antoinette's dress is preserved, named, authenticated, exhibited, and celebrated. It confirms what fashion history values maybe a little too much: silk, court culture, elite women, European luxury, and royal provenance. Of course, it is undeniably important. This dress has only been exhibited 3 times, twice at the ROM and once at Versailles in France. It is so gorgeous and so rare, and I feel very fortunate to have been able to examine it in person at the ROM. However, its brilliance can cast a shadow over other Canadian fashion histories that are less visible because their objects do not survive in the same way, or because their owners were not granted the same archival importance. So please let me introduce Mademoiselle Marie Marguerite Rose. Her story disrupts the white narrative of early Canadian fashion history. Born in 1717 in West Africa, in what is now Guinea, Rose was kidnapped as a child into the slave trade and brought to Louisbourg in 1736. She was purchased by Jean Chrysostome Lopineau, a French naval officer, and forced into domestic labor, including raising his 12 children and maintaining the household. She also had a son who, under the laws of the time, was born into enslavement. Rose's later life, however, reveals extraordinary resilience and agency. She gained her freedom in 1755, married Jean-Baptiste Laurent, a Micmac man who had converted to Roman Catholicism, and together they established a successful restaurant and inn. Rose was respected for her business acumen and conducted some transactions independently of her husband, despite the restrictions of the French law at the time. We know all of this because documents from New France were preserved. When Rose died in 1757, the inventory of her personal possessions, along with the record of their sale, revealed that she owned a wardrobe of dresses, jackets, and skirts. Although these garments showed signs of wear, they were all made from imported fabrics, and some may have been directly sourced from France. No homespun for Rose. The textiles described were mostly cottons, variously embroidered and striped, and the record of these indicate she was fond of vibrant colors and dyed her clothing to achieve this. She also owned a red satin skirt and silk stockings. They must have indeed brightened up the long, gloomy Cape Breton winters. Only her cloaks were heavy woolens of a more reserved nature. Then as now, Canadians preferred a practical overcoat. Rose was also not someone you would want to mess with, as a light flintlock musket was also listed in her personal effects. Of particular significance, though, were her bijoux, a necklace of pearls and one of garnets. As Reynolds states, quote, "Jewelry was not a common adornment among most of the women of Louisbourg, and it was usually reserved for women of upper class or bourgeoisie status." This inventory not only underscores Rose's success and status, but also highlights her connection to the broader transatlantic trade networks that brought luxury goods to the New World. No gown survives in a museum collection, and no painted portrait fixes Marie Marguerite Rose in a pose of fashionable self-display. However, the record of her possessions tell us that she actively participated in Canadian fashion culture. She broadcasted her economic success, and as such, she challenges assumptions about who in early Canada could possess luxury, who could be fashionable, and whose style really shone. In the end, she inarguably also had a much happier ending than the doomed French queen who was publicly executed. Now, let's talk about a little bit more about ribbons. The ribbon skirt is a fascinating adaptation of a globalized fashion product. The ribbon, and the skirt embodies First Nations heritage, matriarchal knowledge, femininity, fertility, equality, and ceremony. Its colors and designs can carry personal, familial, and tribal meanings. Early forms of regalia had been adorned with shells, feathers, quills, wampum, dentalium shells, elk teeth, shell beads, and paints, all of which circulated through pre-colonial trade networks. With colonization, manufactured fabrics and ribbons entered this visual language, especially as traditional materials became harder to access through environmental destruction, including the deliberate destruction of the buffalo. Ribbon skirts are evidence of cultural continuity through transformation. By the 18th and 19th centuries, ribbon-adorned garments and ribbon work appliqué had become part of First Nations sartorial practice. My book also examines colonial communications through travel writing and fashion periodicals. European observers such as Per Kom and John Lambert commented on Canadian dress, often using Europe as a benchmark. Their accounts show that clothing was one of the ways colonial society was interpreted, judged, and performed. Later fashion journals such as The Lady's Companion and Godet's Lady's Book connected colonial women to European trends, etiquette, patterns, and ideals. But my book argues that Canadian fashion was not simply derivative. Imported fashion information entered a specific environment. We have our harsh weather, we have geographic distance, we have First Nations influences, rural production, local dressmakers, and emerging colonial identities. The result was adaptation, not mere imitation. In conclusion, to paraphrase Marshall McLuhan, there are messages in the mediums and materials that built Canada. The very fabric of Canada, both tangible and intangible, carries embedded narratives of our diverse history. I love Canada, and I feel that overall, we do not celebrate ourselves nearly enough. Unfortunately, if there is a lack of interest in the subject, there will be less support for the research. I therefore applaud the many Canadian fashion historical scholars whose work I have drawn upon for my monograph, and the next one that I'm currently working on that will be published by Bloomsbury in 2027, Perspectives on North American Dress History, 19th Century Case Studies from Canada, Mexico, and the United States. Thank you so much to the organizers of this great conference for including my research. I am Dr. Mark Joseph O'Connell.